Hi JVC, I'm happy to be here again to shoot another video, and we're beginning a brand new discipleship module series called Kingdom Citizenship. And our goal with this is to really just look at how our faith relates to our public life and things like politics and other issues that are common in our culture today that we struggle to make sense of with our faith. And we want to really take this opportunity at this time in the nation we live in the world now, to dive in and figure out what the Bible has to say for us in these things. Now you see, there's a reason why you're not supposed to talk about religion or politics in polite gatherings. And it's not because it's good advice not to think deeply about these things, but primarily because talking about religion or politics, and especially if you talk about them both at the same time, is a good way to make a lot of enemies, because a lot of people have some really strong opinions or feelings about religion and politics. So we're going to be spending the next few weeks talking specifically about both religion and politics at the same time. Not because we want to make a whole bunch of enemies, but because despite that saying, it's actually important to know what we believe about these things and also have clarity on how it affects our lives. So specifically, we want to be thinking about how our relationship to God affects our public life and our politics. And in the words of the terminology we're going to be using over the next few weeks, how our citizenship in God's kingdom affects our citizenships in this world. And this video is designed to just introduce the questions and the issues and the ideas that we're going to be grappling with in the next few weeks. And I wanted to dive in by looking at Mark chapter 12, and specifically beginning at verse 13. Let me begin reading from that. Mark chapter 12, and beginning at verse 13. Later, they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus to catch him in his words. And they came to him and said, "Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are, but you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we?" Now, we need to know a little bit of background about this situation. Jesus, at this point in Mark's gospel, in Mark's story of Jesus' life, he has enemies. And specifically, the enemies that he has are the established Jewish religious authorities, people that don't like what he's saying and want him gone. And they've come up with this plan to get rid of Jesus. And they send him people to ask a question that's going to trip him up and catch him and put him in a trap. You see, the question is simple on the surface. It says, should we pay taxes or not? And of course, to our minds in our culture, we think, well, of course you're supposed to pay taxes. It's illegal not to. That's our instinct. But there's more going on than just a question about taxes, because the specific tax that they're talking about in that culture at that time is a tax that the Romans were enforcing on the Jewish nation. The Romans were occupying Israel at this time. They were subjugating the people of God and oppressing them. So in a way, they're asking Jesus, "Hey Jesus, do you think it's right for us to fund the ongoing subjugation and deterioration of God's nation by this foreign, unbelieving, and wicked people with this tax that we pay to them? Should we fund our own destruction as a nation and as God's people?" That's kind of what they're saying. And so Jesus' dilemma as he faces this question in a public setting is this, and this is their intention, Jesus' enemy's intention. Will he side with Caesar or with God? Will he support the human authorities or will he support God's authority? His enemies, in other words, wanted him to get in trouble either with the Romans or with the Jewish people. The Jewish people wanted to side with God. The Romans obviously wanted to side with Caesar. You see, it reflects that in their culture, it seemed like God's kingdom was in trouble. It was about to be snuffed out by this powerful human nation. And that kind of hits us where we are sometimes, where we feel like as a church and as Christians, in situations where our culture is kind of making us feel very small and God's kingdom feeling very insignificant. And so we can ask ourselves, are we going to side with human authority, or are we going to side with God's authority? Are we going to side with Caesar or with God? And so I've drawn these circles on the board to kind of represent maybe the dilemma that we're in. Are we going to side with Caesar over here, or are we going to side with God over here? Who are we going to choose? Well, what does Jesus say? His answer is really interesting, beginning from the end of verse 15. Let me read it. But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. He said this, "Why are you trying to trap me?" he asked. "Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." Now the denarius was a coin that would have been used to pay that tax that they're talking about. And he goes on, they brought him the coin and he asked them, "Whose image is this? And whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. There was a picture of Caesar on the back of a denarius. And then Jesus said to them, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." And they were amazed at him. You see, what Jesus does here is he actually exposes the falseness of their initial question. First of all, he sees right through their hypocrisy and he sees what they're trying to do. And he says, "I'm not going to have any of that." But more interestingly to us, Jesus doesn't accept the false dichotomy that his enemies are setting up between honoring Caesar or God. He presents a reality to us in which we can honor both appropriately at the same time. We can honor the human authorities as well as honoring God at the same time. In fact, I think Jesus is saying that when we're living in God's world, it's our responsibility to honor both. Even when that human authority over us might be a dictator or murderous tyrant, just like Caesar was for the Jews back then. And we should thank God for one, that we don't live under a human authority that's anywhere near something like that. You see, but there's more to what Jesus says here. We can actually live with a confidence, because it's actually not true that God's little nation is on the run from human authorities threatening to stamp them out. It's very important to remember. In fact, what's implied here by Jesus' words, and it's clear elsewhere in the Bible, is that even those places where evil kingdoms or human authorities are oppressing or pressing against the church, God's nation, God's kingdom, God's sovereignty is still ultimately over those human authorities and holding them accountable. And so actually this dichotomy that's set up, this image here with these circles, that's not the reality. That's not a good way to think of things. A better way to think of things would be with our two circles, to have Caesar's circle here, but draw a bigger one representing everything. And that's God's circle. You see, Caesar, or the human authorities that are over us, our politicians or presidents, mayors, and governors, they do have authority over us to some degree. And we honor them rightfully because God has put them over us. They have some things that we need to give back to them in terms of honor. And we'll talk about some of those specifics later on in our times together. But the important thing that Jesus is pointing out is that God owns everything, even the things that Caesar owns as well. God is in control of everything. You see, to conclude today's little introductory video, as Christians, we live as citizens of the nations of the world. And so you could cross out Caesar and put in the President of the United States, or just the United States. And we live under the jurisdiction and as citizens of, well, you know what, I might as well do it, of the United States. You know, we obey the laws of the lands. We pay our taxes. And it's very important that we do that. And God's word would tell us to do that. But we also live as citizens of God's kingdom, in God's world. And that's where our ultimate citizenship lies. And so we're going to spend the next few weeks looking at what that means to live in both kingdoms at the same time, and to be and to belong to God as well as to the human authorities, and how that looks. We're going to look at our place in God's world, in God's nation, and these other nations at the same time. How to honor the human authorities appropriately, and then how to honor God in all things. And I hope that these videos and the material that we put out is going to be helpful for you, especially as we're leading up to an election coming up. And all the other things surrounding it. We need to know how to think and how to pray and how to live out our faith in a way that honors God. And so I hope these videos will be helpful for you.